Hi, if anyone's watching already, I'm Bryan Reynolds, and I'm joined with Julie Jones of Class Valuation, as well as he's a little forgetful, but as well as Mr. John Dingeman, Chief Appraiser with Class Valuation. So, Julie, tell everybody, what are we doing here today?
Yeah, this is really exciting. This is our first kind of co-presented webinar, and it's exclusive for the class valuation panel. This year, just with everybody, being at home more, like our own staff is working from home for the most part. And so we were exploring different ways where we could support our panel, give them information that's actually relevant to them that they could use. And this first topic is about accessory dwelling units. I think there's a lot of great information here. There's been some recent changes from Fannie and Freddie on ADUs. I know that John Dingeman is going to give us some examples as well, but this is a hot topic for us at Class Valuation in the QC department in particular. But the goal here is to really give our class appraisers and our partners just information that they can use. We're also about to announce a benefits package to our class panel. Appraiser eLearning is one of our partners, so thank you very much for that. And so you've got some information to share about that at the end of the presentation, but this is really just an effort to support our appraisers more where they need it. And, continuing education and any kind of info series, to me, is the best way. It always starts with education and background to improve what we can do out there in the field. So thank you, everybody who's joined us. And thank you to Mr. Dingeman for letting me twist your arm to do this. And thank you to Appraiser eLearning.
Great. We're excited to be here. And, anytime there's an opportunity to learn or relearn things, we need to seize that opportunity because no one knows everything. We're in a state of continued learning. And
did I just hear you say that you don't know everything?
Let's not get carried away here. No, I don't know everything. I mean, almost everything doesn't mean everything. So no, I'm still learning. And the thing is, for me, I get excited when I learn something new. And I want to share it with other appraisers around the country because maybe it's a new technique, or maybe it's something I thought I knew that a bright light's been shined on it. And I realized, oh man, I was wrong. Now that's really hard for me to say, Julie. Yeah, I was wrong. but if I'm wrong or I make a mistake, I'll raise my hand and say, oops, I made a mistake. We're all human. We do that. So this is a topic that I'm excited about. I know in my appraisal practice, and I still am a practicing appraiser. Not everyone can say that right now, but I am an appraiser. And I looked at 3 houses today. We have an office in Nashville, and I know in Nashville in particular, we bump into this a lot with the accessory dwelling unit. So I'm excited about this conversation and roping John, your chief appraiser, in to have a conversation about this. Because how do you handle it when you bump into these? Is it just crystal clear you go down this road, or maybe things are not what they seem to be? Maybe you think it's a duplex when maybe you ought to be classifying it as a single family home with an ADU. Or maybe it's a single family home and doesn't meet the definition of an ADU. So let's just jump into it. I'm excited about it. John Dingeman, this is the longest I've been around you without you hearing you talk. So we're gonna let you say something now, Mr. John Dingeman, Chief Appraiser of Class Valuation.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Julie. You didn't have to twist my arm that much. And Bryan, first of all, I'm shocked, number one, that you didn't know my name when we got started. In part because I have my name up on the screen. So aside from the fact that I think you should know it by now, since I call you at all hours of every day.
I think I've met you once or twice. Yeah.
Maybe.
Just real quick, because this is a true story. Was it the first time I met you, John? Was it the very first time we met? I think it might have been. I don't know.
Italian restaurant and the table?
Yes, it was. So it was the first time I met him, and a group of us went to dinner. And by the way, viewers, if you ever get a chance to attend a conference, I recommend you do that, right? Because you're networking, you get to see the AMCs, you get to see the software providers, and you get to hear from a lot of different dynamic speakers. So if you're in a room and you have a horrible speaker, you might only have to listen to them for an hour as opposed to 7 hours, because they are constantly rotating the speaker panel. So I encourage you to go if you've never gone. But I met John and his lovely bride at this event, and we went to dinner with Matt McHale of Global DMS, and I think Bobby. I don't know who all was at the
There
table.
were a bunch of other people at the table.
But we had a conversation about appraising, like we're about to have, just a similar conversation like we're about to have. And lo and behold, the tablecloth was paper. And they had some crayons there. So I don't remember which one of us grabbed a crayon at first, but we're writing all over the tablecloth, trying to demonstrate our points. And I don't know, that was fun. I think I won that conversation.
So it was a great time. It was a great first meeting. I had no idea who you were. The table was full. It was full of appraisers, some spouses. I believe Matt McHale was there, as you said. I think there was an attorney sitting there too. And everyone else remained silent, Bryan. You and I battled each other. And I remember leaving that evening, and I just thought you were friends of friends or something. And I said to Blair, I said, I don't know who that guy is. He thinks he knows everything, you know. And Blair and I typically sit very front row at a conference. And so here we are, front and center. And they introduced the first speaker, and it's Mr. Bryan Reynolds. And I'm looking at this guy, I'm like, holy cow, I'm arguing with this guy. He's a speaker, he's a USPAP instructor. But again, I would say this, it was an open and fair discussion between the two of us. You didn't give me the impression, and as a USPAP instructor, you certainly could have pulled that card out, but you never did. And so I've appreciated that ever since. We've grown to be very good friends. I care about you a lot, and love you like a brother, and I always say it. So thanks for having me, Bryan.
Ditto.
And guys, as much as I love this bromance, I want to talk about accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, just one final point, John. I was right that night, I think. All right. I've got your slide deck ready to roll here, buddy. So you just say where you want to go, and we'll go.
So let's I think we start with the requirements, right? And you mentioned Nashville. Accessory dwelling units, for example, in California are so vitally important, and they're talked about a lot. The governor has written a memorandum in 2016. They wrote an assembly bill in 2020, really trying to expand the use of accessory dwelling units and really force the hands of the local jurisdictions into accepting those, regardless of their current zoning restrictions. And that's all in an attempt to provide affordable housing. Julie has a background with Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae has some very strict requirements, and those recently changed, or at least were updated. I've personally been, challenged Fannie Mae on some of the issues regarding ADUs, but it is so important because the investors are trying to get it right. And one of the things that was mentioned before, I think, Bryan, you said it, is, it's not very clear sometimes. Well, it's also not clear to the client. It may not also be clear to the homeowner. So if, for example, the zoning indicates, for example, in California, the zoning of two-family dwellings is often displayed under the zoning classification or description. Well, the immediate thought to the lender is, I have a duplex. And so that's how they order it. The appraiser, our job is to determine whether it truly is a two-family, a single family with an ADU, or if it's a single family with just two kitchens. So Fannie Mae has some ADU requirements, and they have some musts. It is a guideline, by the way, but only one ADU is permitted per parcel, and the primary dwelling must be one unit. So the ADU must be subordinate in size to the primary dwelling. That's an interesting bullet point, because I think we can all agree. We've seen the old farmhouse that's now been turned into an ADU, and the property owners have built this massive, 4,000 square foot home that they're living in, which has become the primary dwelling. They should have separate features, meaning ingress and egress, They should have a kitchen, a sleeping area, some sort of bathing area, or bathroom facilities. They tell you that an ADU may have, but is not required to include, access to the primary dwelling. However, it's not considered an ADU if it can only be accessed through the primary dwelling, or the area is open to the primary dwelling with no expectation of privacy.
So pause right there a minute. So how I interpret that is it 100% has to have its own direct access, right? Whether that be from maybe a doorway that opens up and a stair going up, stair going down. I don't have to interrupt the privacy of the occupants of the primary improvement, right? Maybe it's a room over the garage where I have an exterior staircase going up to that. Maybe it's a basement where I have an access from the back of the house going into an access, but I have to be able to access this accessory dwelling unit directly without going through the primary residential unit, right?
Correct.
Okay.
That's
Great.
a fair assessment. This is new. The Fannie or Fannie at least says the kitchen must at a minimum contain cabinets, a countertop, a sink with running water, and a stove or a stove hookup. An independent second kitchen by itself does not constitute an ADU. So again, think to yourself, a second kitchen, either partners, a husband and wife, they both love to cook, so they have two kitchens adjacent to each other. Or think to yourself, a man cave or a basement with a kitchen. This is very popular in Colorado, where, mom says, look, you boys go watch football or do whatever it is that you do, but don't come up into my kitchen making a mess. Do whatever you got to do. Cook your hot dogs and hamburgers downstairs.
Yeah, let me pause you there. And where I'm located, it's not uncommon to see properties where they have a secondary kitchen in the basement, and they use it for like canning. They call it a canning kitchen, right? So we grow a big garden and we do all of our work down here in this canning kitchen. We're not going to let somebody come down here to live, right? It's a secondary kitchen for that purpose. In the house I'm in right now, the basement was remodeled, and we put a big wet bar down there with a refrigerator, a dishwasher. Did put a microwave. Wasn't going to put a dishwasher. I said, we got to put a dishwasher in there, but we don't have a stove. We don't have a stove in the basement. But even if we did put a stove down there, it wouldn't be an ADU. I mean, this is the only way to get there is from the interior of the house. It doesn't have a separate access. It would just be a single family residential property that has a basement, and it happens to have a full functioning kitchen in the basement. It's not an ADU. And so I think that's where some of the appraisal community gets a little confused. They automatically think if there's a stove there, it has to be an ADU. And that's a misconception. So, all right, come back to this, John.
It is, right? Because so Brian, just to your point, right? It can be a second kitchen. Now, the appraiser's job there is to then determine if that's allowed in a single family use. We'll get to that,
Right.
But that would be, that's the homework for the appraiser.
Yeah, and look at those last two bulleted items there. An independent second kitchen by itself does not constitute an ADU. That echoes what I just said. The removal of the stove does not change the ADU classification. So if you are in an ADU and just take the stove out, that doesn't necessarily change the ADU classification. That's a great comment too.
Yeah, so just think about that from Fannie Mae's perspective. Brian, if you can stick on that for a second.
Oh, sure.
That's important, right? So for many of us, especially if we're doing FHA appraisals, FHA often says, well, if you want to declassify the accessory dwelling unit, just make sure there's not a cooking appliance there. The stove is gone and the connection is terminated or something of that nature. It's very important because Fannie Mae is making that distinction. You just removing the stove isn't going to change things for them, right? Mm-hmm. So they still believe that, look, it has all of the workings of an accessory dwelling unit, and somebody could just realistically, what can they do? Move the stove back in after the appraiser leaves.
Slide that sucker right back in there. Sure.
Why not? There's a placeholder for it. All right. So examples of ADUs, I think you gave some, but they're not limited to, we can think of them: areas over a garage, a living area in a basement, a small addition, a manufactured home, so think a manufactured home out in the back field for where the primary dwelling is sitting. So those are all examples of ADUs, and sometimes we know what they're not. It makes me think of, I remember, and Bryan, I may have shared this story with you in the past, maybe even at a conference, but it reminds me of a day where there was an accessory dwelling unit. It was clear it was an accessory dwelling unit, and it was above a 4-car garage. That sounds big. The house was, I think, around 5,600 square feet. It was completed on a 1025. That 800 square foot accessory dwelling unit was not driving this property as an investment property. The appraiser did it on a 1025, number one, because that's how it was ordered, and number two, because 2 families lived in it. 2 families is not an example of an ADU.
Right.
Fannie Mae accessory dwelling units in the selling guide. You can find all this information there. There is an announcement 2020-05. And basically this is their update that was released. I believe it was earlier in this year. They clarified ADU property eligibility and the comparable sales requirements for the appraiser. So they expanded the current definition, which we just read. They expanded property eligibility, allowing multi-width manufactured homes to be titled as real property and eligible as an ADU. And then they allowed the appraiser flexibilities that now include an aged settled sale to demonstrate market acceptability, and an active listing or a pending sale as supplement to supplement or exhibit and show marketability. The one thing that I challenged Fannie on at the time was, if you have an illegal ADU, they wanted 3 sales. I think it was 3, might have been 2.
It was 3, yeah.
3 comparable sales with illegal ADUs. And I kept asking the question, somebody show me an MLS system where the agents are marketing these properties as illegal ADUs. Pretty hard to find. So if we move to FHA, they have their own definition. Keep going, Bryan. There we go. They have their own definition in the handbook. You can find it on page 556 of the current handbook. I would encourage you to make sure you're always downloading the most recent version. An accessory dwelling unit refers to a habitable living unit added to, created within, or detached from a primary unit single family dwelling. So think about that, contained within. So they're talking about, it could be a basement, or it could be an attic, it could be a second floor or something of that nature that's contained within the primary dwelling itself. They also give you an idea. It's a separate additional living unit, includes a kitchen, sleeping area, bathroom facilities, similar to Fannie Mae. If we go to the next slide, they do talk about the highest and best use analysis, FHA does. And then they give you an idea of what an ADU usually is. It's usually, again, subordinate in size, location, and appearance to the primary dwelling. But they give you some specific directions about how to treat it in the grid. So the appraiser must not include the living area of the ADU within the calculation of the gross living area of the primary dwelling. What they want is they want it on a separate line item. And appraisers would be well served to use one of the 3 lines on the bottom of the grid, classify it as an ADU. I would probably, or personally, use something similar to the basement description, where I'm putting the square footage of the ADU and the number of bedrooms, baths, probably 1-1. But nonetheless, it can be helpful to the reader of the report.
Yeah, if you're doing this on those, the pre-printed forms, the URAR, Form 70, Form 1004, depending on if it's Freddie or Fannie, there's some blank lines at the bottom of that sales comparison grid, if you will, and you could just put a description as additional features or something like that, and say ADU or guest house or whatever. That's how we've personally handled it in the past. So, yep,
it's a good way to handle it. So those are the definitions, Brian. That's what the expectations of at least Fannie. Freddie is quite similar. FHA has some nuances. Again, I think we've already discussed FHA will allow you, if the accessory dwelling unit is illegal, to call out for the removal of the stove, and that may satisfy their requirements, at least for now. Maybe that will change later, but those pretty much cover the ADUs. I wanted to get into an example that you and I spoke to each other on. It happens to be located in your neck of the woods, and Nashville has some unique circumstances surrounding zoning, classifications, how they tax these properties, and I think this is just a really great example of where the confusion could come from. And I will just preface this by saying the appraiser did a pretty good job of explaining the problem in the situation. There was some concern. It was ordered as a 1025. It didn't look like one, but it was being taxed like one. And we'll get into that. The lender did not really understand the appraisal as it was written. It became confusing. And it really took some effort on our part to walk the lender through and the appraiser through what was necessary to get us from A to Z and over the hump so they could lend on this property and feel comfortable doing so. So this is the property. There's no address or identifying characteristics, but it is from the street. It looks like a typical single family ranch home. With a single door to the front. One level, hard to see from there, but we do have a sloping yard. And if we look at the rear photo, we can see it is a walkout, or what appears to be a walkout basement with some sort of covered deck there. That's what we see from the surface in the street.
Yeah. Now to clarify this, and this, I've got a little insight in this because this is the one you called me and we had a conversation about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but I don't know everything around it, so this is going to be informative to me too, as to see how this ended up working out. But John called me and I shared my thoughts on it, and I was a little in the dark because I didn't see this at the time. I was actually out looking at a property when he called. But John, just so we have clarity here, this back portion here, it looks like that might be a screened in porch or something, screened in deck, one of the two. And then it looks like there is an access door to the basement, right? So
That is correct.
Okay, so somebody could come around, I don't know where the parking is, but if you were approaching this way, you could walk around back, come around the side, enter in that screen porch area, open the door, and be in only the basement area without going through the front of the property, right?
Correct.
Okay, very good.
Correct. So this is interesting, and I'm sharing this for a couple of reasons. And I'm not trying to expand the scope of work. We both hate that as appraisers. You said practicing. My daughter is already in appraisal 102 to become an appraiser. And so I'm frantically running around trying to create templates and figure out how me and her mother help her in some training. So this is a picture of the kitchen in the basement, and there is a sketch. I think for some appraisers, it would be helpful to show access to the property. So provide some doors. How do I enter the front of the house? Where's the door? Looking at the photos, it does orient yourself to the property. And then when you have a situation where you have a second kitchen, or you have a possible accessory dwelling unit, or whatever it is, that you might show how you access it from the interior. We'll see in the appraisal report, the staircase is still there. And either party can walk up or down the stairs and access either the primary dwelling or this basement accessory dwelling unit. But notice,
let me just interject there, because the floor plan that we see here in the PowerPoint presentation I think it's probably very typical for most of the appraisers throughout the country. I mean, this is similar to what we do now. I mean, back in the day, I used to put interior walls in and staircases, and heck, you could put a fireplace, and I even put the bathroom fixtures, and so I've moved to this, and actually, Fannie Mae doesn't even require that you label the rooms. You could just draw a rectangular box like that, and you could have none of this information in there per Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Now, some clients will want it, but in this instance, if you're claiming ADU, because I asked you this, John, right before we went live on this broadcast, could you get down here from this level from the interior? Because the question is kind of open just by looking at the floor plan. So it might be meaningful to have that staircase in this example when we're talking about the challenge as to whether or not this is an ADU, and that was the challenge with this one, right?
Right, and to be fair, we didn't have this sketch when you and I originally started speaking. This was, to that point, it was just the appraiser working with us, trying to figure out what they're supposed to do with this property. Okay. Regarding sketch and calculation requirements, so you brought it up, Fannie Mae and the selling guide B4-1.2-01 does provide you the requirements for the building sketch calculation. So an exterior building sketch that indicates the dimensions and calculations demonstrated to provide your estimate of the gross living area, how you calculated it, right? If the floor plan is atypical or functionally obsolete, thus limiting the market appeal, then they do require the floor plan include, say, interior walls.
Right.
That's
right.
interesting. But yeah.
So you people watching right now just learned something probably, because most of you do this and you're doing more work than you need to. Now, again, you may have a client or an AMC that wants you to do it, and you need to figure that out. But it is not a Fannie Mae requirement to label this living room, kitchen, den, but you don't have to do that. So this could just be a big white box with the dimensions and then your calculations of how you get square footage. Now, as John said, if there's functional obsolescence attributable to the floor plan, then they want to see that, right? They want to see that. And FHA says this something very similar. Right. So, but probably most appraisers do this, I would think, John. You review a lot of appraisal reports throughout the country, and I would venture to say most of them are very similar to this. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think, Brian. I don't think we at Class have a single client that doesn't require labeling.
Okay.
Nobody's requiring doors and stairs and fireplaces and all that stuff.
But most of your lending community clients want that.
Yes, they do.
Okay. All right. Very good.
So this appraiser, I really brought in 4 sections of the report that were important that we tried to convey to the lender and also presented some challenges. First was the page 1, specific zoning classification and zoning description. For many appraisers, when they're dealing with either, again, any one of these scenarios, but an accessory dwelling unit, a duplex, a second kitchen, whatever it is, even if the zoning classification was residential and the zoning description was single family acceptable, the appraiser should probably expand on the zoning description to talk about what's allowed and not allowed within that zoning classification. Oftentimes what we find, the appraiser didn't do it here, is we find appraisers using the use code from the county assessor. Now there's a reason they do it. They're using tools to import into their appraisal report. Those tools are often pulling from their aggregator. So say, for example, whatever public records sources within your MLS system, right? Or they're manually typing in from there. But nonetheless, the appraiser did put in their residential single family residence, and then the appraiser thankfully did include their highest and best use analysis underneath of that.
Let me jump in here though, John, and we're not trying to embarrass somebody or belittle them or throw them under the bus, and we don't know who this appraiser was, so we have no idea who it was. But this says specific zoning classification.
Mm-hmm.
residential. If I called, and guys, I can do this. If John engaged me to do a review on this, I could look up the county, right? It's on page 1 of the URAR. I could call the planning and zoning department for that city. I could give them the address. And quite frankly, even in my little town of Kentucky, it's all online. I don't even have to call anybody. I can pull up the address and in seconds see the specific zoning classification. Now, in my community, we don't have anything that just says residential. Now, a couple of rural counties next to me do, but most of the time, the specific zoning class in my community would be R1A or R1B or R1C or R4DT intercity residential. Is this, and maybe you don't even know, John, but is residential really the specific zoning class for this property?
No, it's not the specific zoning
So
classification.
guys, appraisers, if you're watching this right now, I know this is a separate issue, but it really is an issue. If this lender wanted to get real picky, they could say, you know, this is a little misleading, guys. This is asking you for the specific zoning classification, and you just put residential. Over here, zoning description, single family acceptable. I don't know that that's the description. So we need to step up our game a little bit and get to, you know, it's easy to say, I'm in a residential neighborhood, so it's got to be residential. I'm going to type residential. Appraisers have done that for decades. But when UAD came out and when the appraisal report and data delivery guide came out for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, they made it very clear, we want the specific zoning class. So, you know, and Fannie, I just got a call today where a gentleman got a complaint from Fannie Mae. That's the third one I've gotten in the last couple of months. Right. So be careful that you're doing that, guys.
Right.
Sorry.
So no, thanks, Brian. Highest and best use was at least covered there. It is notable that the appraiser concluded to a single family residence as being the highest and best use. In the addendum, the appraiser said this subject is classified. And I highlighted some of this stuff because it's important. It's one paragraph. There's no use of capitalization for things like duplex use code, which is what we would be talking about. But the subject is classified and taxed as a duplex by the local tax assessor. The subject has 2 electric meters. That may or may not be important, but the appraiser thought it was important enough to discuss here. And an additional kitchen in the basement area. There is interior and exterior access to both levels of the home. So that was also described here, not in the sketch, but described narratively. And the basement is being treated as an accessory unit. The predominant use, this is important, the predominant use in the neighborhood for homes similar to the subject is to be owner occupied with a rentable accessory unit, which that was considered in the highest and best use analysis. So I would go back to the zoning description. And is there enough information in there to let me know, for example, that you can have tenant occupied accessory dwelling units in that zoning classification, right? The appraiser did say it was legal non-conforming. I've got some thoughts there. And then says to be reclassified as a single family residence, the 2 electric meters must be consolidated into 1 meter and the kitchen removed. Now, thankfully, the appraiser also, let's move down just a little bit, Brian, did say in the comparable approach that 2 of the comparables had a similar area to the subject property, which was a basement and at least a kitchen area. And the appraiser did complete this report as is, not subject to anything. The reason I highlighted that one sentence in red is that really is the sticking point for the client. They didn't understand how the highest and best use on page 1 is single family residence and the report's completed as is when the appraiser is talking about a reclassification as a single family residence, suggesting it's not now, therefore it should be subject to, and therefore and if it's not subject to, then it's probably not a single family residence today, right? So this became a big challenge. It became a challenge for the appraiser. The appraiser in the appraiser's head, they knew exactly what they were talking about. they felt like they knew exactly what they were talking about and that they conveyed the message properly. Unfortunately, that may hold true in a homogeneous neighborhood with all like homes or a PUD or something like that. But there was a unique circumstance here, and I'll share with you some of that information that suggests we should probably be telling more of the story here. Doesn't have to be a novel, but probably something more than what was described here and with clarity.
Yeah, this is almost contradictory, isn't it? Or maybe take the word almost out of there. This appears somewhat contradictory, doesn't it? He says that, you know, it's single family, highest and best use is single family. The appraiser's clearly trying here. I mean, they're
very hard.
They're not trying to create a misleading report. They're trying to achieve credible assignment results. So, you know, I tip my hat to the appraiser for trying. I mean, the appraiser needs to step up their game a little bit here and here. I think that's undisputable. Unless I call planning and zoning, it really is residential, which I bet it's not. But other than that, they're trying. But it's a little contradictory here, as John said, you know, to be classified as single family, you have to do this to accomplish that. But yet I'm going to go ahead and appraise it as is.
Right. So let me just do this. So what we're reading in the next several slides, Bryan, is a response that I wrote up as if I were writing the report. And I broke it up into a few different slides because number one, I wanted to make sure everybody could read it. The second part is I wrote it the way I would write it in a report, breaking up some paragraphs into very small paragraphs. And when you look at it, I wish I could show you in a report. It's really not that long. It fits well within even the additional addendum above the cost approach. But here's what I did. So you mentioned calling the local jurisdiction for the zoning classification. I didn't actually call the city of Nashville, but I happened to call another appraiser there who knew the assessor. I reached the assessor who happened to say, you know, the residential manager just walked past my office. He's the best person. Let's have you talk to him. The gentleman was so kind to me, spent an hour on the phone discussing the problem, the issue. He was very sympathetic towards the appraiser. He admitted in his 20 years of service for the assessor, this happens almost daily, and it happens because of the confusion around the use code. And you know, when I spoke to you, I think it travels all the way up to the Supreme Court, actually, on why the use codes are designed the way they are, and for taxation purposes, very hard to change. But he was very helpful. And again, not suggesting that you have to spend an hour, but in that time, I learned a lot about an area that I don't even appraise in. And so one of the things that we can do is just understand here, was the appraiser clear in their analysis and reporting? I think we've already agreed no. The lender wasn't tracking. So now that the lender's coming back 2, 3, 4 times, trying to get an explanation, tells the appraiser, we're not speaking the same language. They're not understanding me. So maybe I have to take a step back and reposition myself so that they do understand. I mean, that's a real problem and real possibility, right? So again, I called several appraisers. I called the assessor's office. And I would tell you this, you and I both teach home measurement specialist courses. One of the things that we're always talking about is the assessor has their own goals and aspirations with the information that they have in their system. And yes, we all access it, but it is something they've never intended for lenders, real estate sales agents, appraisers to rely on, right? They're using it for mass appraisals, and they're using it for taxation purposes. And what stood out to me is the assessor was reminding me of this probably 3 or 4 times throughout the hour that we spoke. Right? Pretty incredible. So better language, tell the story. I think I'm going to the next slide, Bryan. So I'm spelling it out for the lender in this example. So I'm saying for lending purposes, the difference between a single family residence and with an accessory dwelling in it and a 2 to 4 family small residential income property, again, using words they're familiar with and that are associated with the forms, because remember, this was ordered as a 1025. Now the appraiser's putting it on a 1004. Is the appraiser's opinion of the appeal to the typical buyer, assuming all uses are legal. The county assessor makes no such assumptions. All structures with 2 dwellings under one roof receive a duplex code. That comes from the assessor, not me as the author, but from the assessor. The subject use code classification is called a duplex by the local tax assessor with the purpose of taxation only, a reminder to the client, and the completion of mass appraisals, and not for the use or reliance of lenders and or appraisers, putting a disclaimer in there. The subject has 2 electric meters, which, by the way, the assessor said did not define the duplex. What's interesting is it may have driven them to that code, but it doesn't define it. You mentioned something earlier, what does for this jurisdiction, not only is it how the property is set up, so there's a kitchen and a living area and all that stuff, Brian, but the assessor was very specific that they also look at intent. What is the intent of the current occupant, right? Do they intend to rent this out? Do they have it rented out, right? So anyways, the subject has 2 electric meters and an additional kitchen in the basement area with both interior, exterior access to both levels of the home. I really just took what the appraiser was saying in the report there, trying to share that information, right?
I want to pause here for just a second, and we do have some comments coming in, and so I'll ask you a question or a comment here in just a second. But I want to remind the viewers, when we talk about market value and how market value is achieved, the scarcity, utility, desirability, and purchasing power or transferability. That's what creates value. What creates value? Man, as a valuation expert, you better know the answer to that. Scarcity, utility, desire, and purchasing power. That's the 4 economic influences that create value. And our job as appraisers, or like I call us, analysts, we're charged with analyzing the actions of typical market participants. So market value is achieved through the eyes of a typical buyer. All you have to do with regard to the seller is to make sure, number one, they're well informed. They're acting in what they think is their own best interest, and they're not under any duress to sell that property. From that point, you put the seller aside. Market value is achieved through the eyes of the typical buyer, not the seller. Who is the typical buyer, and what are they going to do with that property? Maybe the present occupant utilizes that as an ADU or has their mother-in-law in there, right? But what we want to know is, who's the typical buyer and what are they going to do with that property? That's how you measure market value, right? There's a comment here, John, I'm going to read this off, and we encourage you guys to participate. So write your questions and Ben will forward those over to us. Alan says, that's because the client will ask you what would need to be done to make sure this legal if it needs to be reconstruction due to a fire. I guess if it burned down, could it be reconstructed is probably what he's saying there, John.
Right.
Thank you, Alan, for that comment. All right, let's move forward with this little case study. And this is a real live case, by the way, right, John? This is not
real live case.
Yeah.
Really just resolved this past week. So
okay.
It was really, timing couldn't have been better. So Brian, I love what you just said. You talked about the typical buyer, which is why I led into it with that paragraph, because this next paragraph is what I learned from the assessor. Now, keep in mind, this is also a purchase. I didn't tell you that. It is a purchase. And the one thing I kept asking both the lender and the appraiser is, has anybody talked to the buyer?
What's the buyer going to do with it?
Right.
Yeah.
All I knew about the buyer was they were stuck in a hotel room waiting for this thing to close.
Oh my goodness.
So the basement,
really, they were in a hotel room saying, y'all hurry up. I want to move into this thing. Huh?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were.
Wow.
So
right.
I use the language again from the
By
appraiser.
the way, John, if that happens again, I have an Airbnb in Nashville. So
I could have directed them to you. I understand.
I got a renter.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
You probably would have done it for free.
Oh, well, let's not get carried away.
Right. The basement is being treated as an accessory unit that can be legally rented under the current residential zoning. That's exactly what the appraiser stated previously.
Right.
Now, here's what's interesting. The assessor says there are 2,975 assigned homes to that neighborhood. Now, I don't know what that means. You know, would you and I look at it and say, you know, it's really probably 300 or 500 or 7,000 homes? I don't know. But my point is they talked about there's 2,975 assigned homes in the subject's neighborhood. And they said they're single family residential. Out of the 2,975, there were only 41 of those homes that shared the duplex use code. Notice I capitalized it again, the duplex use code classification. Okay, so not a lot. So the assessor sympathized. The appraiser didn't have a lot to choose from, even if they wanted to go that route to find other homes that shared the same use code.
Yeah.
What's really interesting, and you talked about the typical buyer. So let's look at the last two sales. The most recent was in 2018. And what did the buyer do? They removed the kitchen and applied for the assessor to reclassify it as a single family. So they didn't buy it with the intent of using that accessory dwelling unit. And then the sale after that, you'd have to go back to 2015. That's not going to help the appraiser or the lender. They're going to be like, what are you talking about? The last sale was 2015. There is an indeterminate number of homes that include a similar accessory dwelling unit within the single family use code. And per the county assessor, this is not a search feature within their database. So the assessor, in other words, Bryan admits there's probably more than 41 with a basement, a kitchen basement. In fact, comps number 1 and 3 that the appraiser used and identified as homes similar to, they had single family use codes. The assessor wasn't aware of them. They're not out chasing homeowners. They're not inspecting homes. It's, hey, did somebody tell me about this, right?
Gotcha.
The typical buyer, according to the market participants. So what did I do? I then called some agents that I saw farm the area, and I asked them the question, what would a typical buyer buy this home for? And they said it would be to purchase the home, to remain as a single family residential property. They would probably occupy the home by themselves or to supplement their income, help pay the mortgage, rent out the basement ADU. Or like in 2018, they're just going to deconstruct the kitchen and get it reclassified, take advantage of a lower tax rate.
So what that tells us, even if they buy it, move into it, and use the lower level as an ADU, the typical buyer would not construe this as a multifamily home. In other words, a duplex.
Correct.
Okay.
Pretty interesting, right? And then the home was originally built as single family residence, and the use code classification was changed sometime before 1999, which is as far back as the assessor can search digitally. So I'm telling the reader of the report what the assessor told me. The assessor also said, look, you know, it was probably the installation of the second meter, though, that drew their attention. They wouldn't have actively gone out. So when the utility company said, hey, we're installing a second meter, they said, oh, I wonder what that is. They go out and now they reclassify it. As a point of reference, the subject actually isn't that it's legal non-conforming. It's legal as a single family with an ADU in that jurisdiction. So under the zoning classification. So it really isn't legal non-conforming. And a homeowner, this is important. So
it's not, let me catch up. It's not legal non-conforming. It's just legal is what you're saying.
It's just legal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the appraiser's assumption that it was legal non-conforming is that the use code was somehow overruling the zoning classification, right?
Yeah, so normally when we talk about a legal non-conforming, we as appraisers, we think of, okay, well, the property was built as a single family. Now the zoning has changed to commercial, right? It doesn't meet the current zoning. However, it was there first. So although it doesn't conform, it's legal non-conforming. Another term we use for that commonly is called grandfathered. It's grandfathered in. But it sounds like some assumptions were made on this that no, this is just legal. It's not that it's non-conforming, it's just purely legal. So that brings me back to my original statement about the specific zoning class probably isn't just residential. I mean, it might be, but probably something different, right?
Something different.
Yeah.
So Bryan, the last paragraph was intended when I had the conversation with the lender, the underwriter, and trying to understand the disconnect in the language. Remember, I highlighted that one sentence in red talking about reclassification as a single family residence, right? It wasn't about reclassifying as a single family residence. It's about reclassifying that property with a single family use code. So I say a homeowner, this is per the assessor, homeowner has the opportunity to appeal their taxes annually. And if any future owner, not just this one, if any future owner of the property prefers to reclassify the use code and adjust their taxes, they should seek the advice of the county assessor, which may require the removal of the basement kitchen and or make other modifications. The assessor said, by the way, no, you don't have to remove the meter. If we go back out there and there's no kitchen and you just want 2 meters on your house, that's up to you.
Wow.
But there's no kitchen, there's no intent, there's no ADU. So that concludes what I wrote. And I think, and I would hope that appraisers understand that didn't take a lot of effort, but it paints a better story. And once this was shared with the lender, so I wrote a letter to the lender trying to help explain, then it was a moot point. The proverbial bell rang and they understood, we're talking about use codes. Doesn't have anything to do with the zoning. Doesn't have anything to do with what the typical buyer would do. The appraiser demonstrated marketability with comps 1 and 3. The value, the opinion of value was weighted at comps 1 and 3 also. So.
I like this statement you have here. The use code has no impact on the marketability of the subject property.
No use code, right? And again, just a reiteration, pointing them back to page 1. For this appraisal, the appraisers determined the typical buyer would view and consider the subject as a single family residential property, which is not only consistent with the highest and best use analysis as stated on page 1, but also local zoning. Boom. We got it covered. And I share this example because I think from the pictures when we started, Bryan, and based on our conversations and even with the appraiser and the lender, here's a situation where it's not clearly defined and understood and you have all this conflicting information. I think it could be equally as confusing in other scenarios. But for some of us, it might be a little easier when it's detached above the garage or it's just its own building, you know, and it might be easier for an appraiser to kind of extrapolate that.
Yeah. And I know we're running out of time and I want to just spend a couple of minutes, even if it's just a minute or two on some suggestions for folks watching. If you find yourself in a situation and you say, no, this one is definitely an ADU, right? And I don't know how to solve this valuation problem because I've got no comps that also have ADUs. So we'll address that in just a minute. We had a couple of other comments and I think they were just comments and that's fine. We encourage comments. We also encourage questions and thank you guys for watching. We're glad that you're here. We're going to do some more of these and we certainly want your interaction. So this is an opportunity for you to get to know the class folks and you got the chief appraiser right here for crying out loud. So feel free to ask him some questions, beat him up a little bit. Kent makes a comment. It is amazing. Is it amazing to anyone else that 50% of all buyers are stuck in a motel room until closing, laughing out loud? Maybe not quite 50%, but realtors love that comment. So I guess he's heard that one before, John. And then Dan makes a comment as well. And thank you, Kent and Dan, for chiming in. I think these are kind of cute. Dan says, if my mentor had told me that I would have to be a lawyer to do my job, I would have quit. So I don't think you have to be a lawyer to be an appraiser, but I get the jab there, the gist. I applaud you guys both for being here and watching this. You didn't have to be here today. And so everyone watching, I applaud you for being here and just getting a different perspective or maybe an opportunity to learn. You may have known everything John and I and Julia and I have covered today. But so let's talk real quick. John, you're in a scenario, you're appraising a property, because I find myself in this, and I think appraisers can relate to this. You're appraising a property. You're in an established neighborhood. I've got whatever it is, a 2-story house, 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, couple thousand square feet. And I got plenty of those. I got comps coming out my ears. Yeah. The problem is my subject property has a little building on the back of the site. Used to maybe be a garage that someone along the way converted to an ADU. It's got a full functioning kitchen. It's got a full bathroom. Let's say it's even got a little bedroom. It could be a studio like my condo and not a bedroom, but a sleeping area, right? It is clearly an ADU. The current owner's got it rented out. They rent it for $300 a month. And so you're doing your appraisal and you're doing your sales comparison approach. And you're like, man, I know John said I could put it on the bottom of the sales comparison grid as an additional feature. And I'm going to put in there guest house or ADU or small rental, 1-bedroom rental on the back of the site. It's permissible for zoning. That's not an issue. We know it's an ADU. How do I adjust for that? Where do I get an adjustment? I can't find any other comps with it. So I don't really have a good paired sales. So let's talk about that real quick. There's 2 things that I've done that, underwriters have not beat me up on. And there's more than 2. There's a market survey technique too. I'm using that in a litigation case right now. In fact, I'm going to conduct a study. I'm going to do a market survey of primary market participants, and I'm going to do a market survey of secondary market participants. Okay. But on these 2, one, you could do an income comparison, maybe try and find other 1-bedroom units and find out what they're renting for. All right. So the rents are this. I extract a GRM or GIM if that's the case. I'm going to capitalize that. Based on the rental income of that, it's going to contribute, $20,000 or $30,000. I'm going to make a singular line item adjustment, 30, 30, 30. If you got 4 comps, another 30. But I need to explain that. So when the chief appraiser looks at it, right, they can see my support and my rationale of why I put $30,000 as a line item adjustment across the board, right? Another thing we did, we called Scott Cullen on one and had him help us. Depreciation by textbook definition is defined as the difference between cost and value on the same day. Cost minus value equals depreciation. Well, surprise, if you have 2 of those, you solve the third. Cost minus value equals depreciation. So let's just say I don't know the value, right? We've got good comps. None of them have an ADU. If I can estimate the cost, which I can do, if I can estimate the depreciation, and on the one we did, we got Scott Cullen to help us. He's got that Solomon adjustment calculator. And so what we did with Scott was we figured up the cost, which was a National Housing Cost Manual. And we used the life expectancy out of those published manuals. We actually used the age, and then we used an age life method for depreciation. So we figured up the cost. We estimated the depreciation. Cost minus depreciation equals value. And we put that in as a line item across the board. And guess what? We did get a call from the underwriter. And then we explained how we got that adjustment. We did a depreciated cost analysis. Here it is. And they said, thank you very much. No further questions. And it worked perfectly.
I'm sorry you got the call from an underwriter. So we at Class, we have, I think it's 21 or 4 appraisers on staff. Julie's one of them. I'm one of them. On the QC escalations team, a number of them, we have a Cert Gen, we have mostly Cert Res, a couple licensed. They would have read that report and been able to explain that to the underwriter, hopefully relieving you of any having to communicate that. I would just say a couple of things there. You talked about across-board adjustments, and again, we're running up against the clock.
Sure. For
many appraisers, what they end up saying is, you know what, it's across the board. How about I just give it no value? And then it's going to go away. A $0 adjustment has to be supported. It is an adjustment.
Right.
$0 is an adjustment. It has to be supported like any other. And I think appraisers do fall victim to the concept of paired sales. That's what underwriters are mostly familiar with. And so they're always looking for paired sales, paired sales, paired sales. And there are really about 27 different ways, not on every possible adjustment, but there's multiple different ways to extract and support an adjustment, even if it's across the board.
Hey, why don't we do another one of these on supporting adjustments? I think that would be a great conversation since we're out of time. And Julie's like, guys, you shut up. We're done. So thank you guys for letting me play along with you today. This has been fun. John, I know, loves talking about appraising. I can't have a conversation with him unless it's about appraising, which is fine because, if you haven't noticed, I like talking about it too. So, hey, we're real happy to be here and a part of the discussion. Appraiser eLearning has partnered up with Class to do a few things for you guys. If you're on the preferred panel, we have actually agreed to give you access free to some of our training webinars. Those are typically 2 hours in length, and you can kind of get some things that are tangible you can walk away from. I'll let Julie maybe touch on that, and or Benjamin. And then finally, we're going to give some discounts to any of our online education. So if you need some CE, please at least consider us. We work really hard to try and give you very good content, cutting edge information, and we do it kind of with a twist. We try to make it fun. So Julie, thanks for putting this thing together. This was fun.
Hey, thanks for joining us and partnering up with us. I think this provides a great benefit to our panel and what you mentioned earlier. So just so you know, like as a class appraiser, if you're a class act appraiser, which means that you're our top performing appraisers within your county, then you do get a deeper discount on some of that CE. Class appraisers in general get, I want to say it's a 20% discount. I can't remember. I'll have to look. But we will be recording, or this session was recorded, and we'll be sending out the recording here probably on Tuesday, I'm thinking. We'll send that out, and then we'll also send out those discount codes to our class panel. Just so that you have them. And then, as you mentioned also, Bryan, we'll have some special series for the Class Act panel. And then these are going to be quarterly. So I'm looking forward to a good discussion next time. So we're in the fourth quarter. Can you believe that?
Crazy. Very hard to believe.
Can I just thank, look, for all of our appraisers that are participating and will be watching, you're such a valued partner in what we do. And I thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule for participating.
Now more than ever, like volume is crazy. And I know that it takes a lot for you to watch a 1 hour series. And so, if for people that weren't able to join the entire time, it's going to be recorded and sent back out. So I appreciate Appraiser eLearning, Bryan, you in particular, and you, Ben, for agreeing to do this with us. This has been a lot of fun, and thank you, Mr. Dingeman, as always, for keeping us in line.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Bryan, Ben. Love you guys.
Thanks, guys.
He doesn't love me, but it's fine. It's fine.
I love you, Julie.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.